Enjoy the show? Consider checking out the Lost Sun Society Patreon, which has all the episodes ad-free forever and much more to come in the future. Go to patreon.com/Lost Sun Society or check out the link in the description. Enjoy the show. Welcome back to the Lost Sun Society, Episode 2, 12 Minutes. On the morning of Wednesday the 8th, July 2043, Rita Noorani was running alone up a hill at the very edge of what was considered North London. She later recounted in her notes that she had been preparing for a marathon, training which had not been going very well, and she had taken the day off to disconnect from the world around her. When she came to a stop, something of the atmosphere at those hours made her want to take a picture of the city in the distance. I've seen the resulting picture and the scattered notes that Rita would write to accompany it. The original photo print is small, quite surprisingly small, given that it is one of the most famous pictures ever taken, and it comes in around 6.5 inches. Noorani was not an artist by trade, and had never intended for the photo to be anything other than something she sent to her closest friends. Later in life, she was always bitterly self-deprecating about the picture, always downplaying it, and always refusing what fame it brought her. So the framing of the picture itself is shaky, the quality is a little poor, but it remains deeply, emotionally, and historically important. Noorani had taken the photo at 7:33 a.m, and by sheer chance, she had captured the exact moment that one of the first bombs hit London. A lot of the photo is just white space, as the light completely overwhelmed the sensors of the camera, but just about, you can still spot the landscape that makes it unmistakably London. That first blast killed over 1 million people, and it's held forever in a 6-inch rectangle, the moment when the world was ruptured. Rita never gave the photo a name, and although it has carried many aliases since, it has officially been referred to simply as Photo 1. Rita Noorani was one of countless people, unrelated and unconnected to the wider war, who happened to be in the right place when the 12 minutes began. She was not a casualty, nor was she a fatality. By sheer chance alone, she would survive. She was also a part of those who could only watch as things collapsed around them, because there was nothing to be done at that point. The end of the world had come. Today, we're going to talk about what happened during the 12 minutes, why it happened, and how it happened. Doing this is made measurably more difficult by the fact that as we get closer and closer to the date, the number of available sources just drops off a cliff. Whether this was because the people involved were killed in the attacks themselves, or later purged from the historical records, it creates a contradiction where the closer we get to perhaps the most important and singular event in human history, the less information we actually have. As is the purpose of the Lost Sun Society, I will try to fill the gaps as best I can, but there might be a lot of questions which end with a rather conclusive, we don't know. The popular image of the Isles in the lead up to the 12 minutes is so often cast as one in the midst of absolute and total war, a nation roused to fight for the sake of their future, children, and nation, and so on and so forth. In this image, the United Kingdom is supposedly fighting at home and abroad, and has dedicated the entire machinery of state to this purpose. The origins of this tradition, the so-called heroic war, are murky at best, but can best be described as a post-war reckoning with the reality of the war, which had been fought over very little and cost so much. It casts our forefathers as tragic figures who were doing the best they could with what they had, and that the community behind them was a united force. The imaginary struggling Brit is a very popular image in our cultural foreground, whether they are some kind of soldier or government bureaucrat or, God forbid, a member of parliament. It creates the image of a simpler time in which the Isles were good and the people outside it were bad, and the one that was broken apart by the singular horror of nuclear war. But all the information we have from the time seems to suggest otherwise, that the United Kingdom had never officially declared war on anyone, and had, in fact, been operating in more of a supporting capacity towards its allies, who were more deeply embedded within the war effort. That's not to say that there was not British soldiers deployed abroad, but rather that until it escalated, the war was both politically and economically limited. The reality of the situation abroad was quite divorced from the perception of it. The United Kingdom of the era had many perceived enemies, and it was taken for granted that they were constantly working to undermine and undo the security of the state. But the reversal of this was also true, to assume that the United Kingdom was constantly doing the same to its enemies, working to undermine the security of their state. Though it was occasionally met with posturing, it was never really out of the question that the nation was on the receiving end of attacks to its digital infrastructure or its installations abroad or at the very heart of its institutions. And it was also never out of the question that we were planning on returning the same courtesy to the motley collection of enemies at that time. To the average citizen, there really was no reason to be particularly worried at any one point, because these things just seemed to happen. It would be present in the background of any news of the day, or it would occasionally flare up and dominate the headlines, but it never stopped the day-to-day function of the nation. It was ordinary. So to hear that British troops were deployed here or there, or the intelligence services were closely assisting one ally as they were embroiled in their own conflict, you wouldn't particularly be surprised. The result of all this posturing and friendly sabotage was that the United Kingdom had slowly and inexorably been drawn into a conflict that it had very little to gain from, but which it continued operating within under the assumption it was part of the average realpolitik that defined this era. By all accounts, we don't really have any evidence that this was a direct conflict between the Isles, its allies, and one of its perceived enemies, but that it was something of a proxy war or indirect attack that suddenly and massively escalated. From what we can tell, the change from conventional conflict to nuclear exchange was unexpected, so much so that the government of the hour had never really switched to a war footing. There was no definitive moment when it seemed that the exchange was inevitable, because there was very little in the way of grand speeches, public announcements of intention, or reliable reporting of the matter by the media groups of the day. As I mentioned last week, there was a culture of instant and constant access that pervaded the kingdom, and this certainly extended to the way in which information was packaged and then distributed. Your average citizen was met with a constant and dizzying spew of information at all hours of the day, much of it framed to provoke panic or anger or sadness. The most common response to this would be to simply shut it all out, find a way to disengage. Find ways to consume without really consuming it. Find a way to consume only the smallest portion of it. What this meant was that very real reports about the escalation of the war became lost in a tide of similarly instant news that was given as much weight as the war itself. So, culturally, the vast majority of citizens wouldn't have believed themselves to have been at war with any one nation, nor would they have been told just how much the nation within which they worked was contributing towards war efforts abroad. Economically, nothing much would have seemed to have changed, and day-to-day life continued. You never would have thought that nuclear war was about to occur, until it did. I would also forgive you for thinking that this blindness to the situation did not permeate towards the top, but unfortunately, we now have to turn to the man of the hour. Last episode, we introduced Peter Newfield and his rise through the ranks of the Rotten system, and how he came to sit at the top of the pile as Prime Minister. Yet, his speech at the beginning of 2040 really marks the beginning of the end for Newfield and his coalition of readmitted radicals. Because as soon as Newfield became Prime Minister, achieved that goal he had obsessed with for so long, he was confronted by the fact that there was really not any way in which his unconventional methods of advancement could help him. With his coalition in the heart of cabinet, there was no more room for him to defect. No other factions who would even consider admitting him. He was effectively paralysed. And it quickly became apparent that Newfield wasn't fit for the job, nor was he particularly interested in major aspects of the job. As it turned out, quite a few of the responsibilities of the Prime Minister were not ones that aligned with Newfield's whole way of being. The ability to act as a punching bag had served him well in previous roles, but now well, he was just kind of getting punched repeatedly. His sense of authority was nearly constantly undermined, and he had no stomach for the more technical aspects of the role. He would constantly dream of or create new plans for how to tackle the worst elements of the rotten system, yet these would evaporate in contact with the rigid nature of the political environment. I can't really say whether he would have found a way to break through here. It is possible that he could have achieved a sense of legislative momentum if he had managed to get through a few of his proposed legislations. But that's besides the point, because as soon as Peter Newfield encountered these obstacles, he threw up his hands and said, "That's it, I'm out." This sounds like he was planning to resign, but no. For whatever reason, Newfield dug his heels in and refused to move. The role of Prime Minister was now technically filled, but it was practically vacant. In any saner world, this would have been immediately met with his removal from the role, whether that was by party or by opposition. But, if you can remember, Newfield had taken a great deal of time in his campaigning for the role, carving it out and handing out authorities of the Prime Minister to the various people who would come to support him. And these people had no interest in letting this funny little man go and potentially allow their powers to slip away with him. By as early as 2041, the cabal of advisors and lobbyists and MPs had easily come to terms with the fact that the man in charge had decided to resign even more of his control over to them. Whatever acts of spite he had planned, whatever his refusal to leave meant, it was small fry compared to the blank check that he had just handed them. These were not the types to be quietly and competently steering the situation behind the scenes. Each of these groups had only their self-interests in mind, and now could really begin tearing the copper wires out of the wall for scrap. Most of their actions which they began to take were, to put it lightly, extremely illegal. But who was left to stop them? The radical movement had been beheaded by the blackout weeks. Moderate opposition, such as the Wednesday group, lacked any organisational power, and the vast majority just accepted the assorted terrible changes as they came. The general apathy of those around the role of Prime Minister might have been able to continue unabated had it not been for the fact that the world had been slowly and inexorably teetering towards a nuclear exchange for a number of weeks, and that the nation was effectively functioning without its head. The state's paralysis had manifested in a much more concentrated manner in the weeks leading up to July 8th, and it would really come to matter when push came to shove. So, we know that the government was making the most of the opportunity to tear itself apart, but that shouldn't have subtracted from the fact that there were a number of contingencies in place to prepare for nuclear war, surely. The strategy of the central government in regards to nuclear war had remained consistent with those that had emerged during the late 20th century. They assumed, after a successful transition to a state of vigilance in anticipation of war, there would be a relocation of key assets from London into safe locations, given that London would almost certainly be destroyed. All of this would be done covertly. Regional headquarters would be prepared, and the public slowly made aware of the fact that war was imminent. Reserve forces would be mobilised, and further civil defence mobilising would continue. After the attack itself, the prepared regional headquarters would then take charge of their reconstruction efforts, and would come to be reorganised under the relocated central government whenever it was ready for them. All of this would coincide with a general crackdown on civil society, allowing dangerous agitators to be removed, key industries to be appropriated, and anything that was of any worth to the government to be taken for the good of the nation, by force if necessary. On paper, the government of the United Kingdom would be prepared for a nuclear attack. As you might have guessed, these long-laid plans had been crucially undermined by the same force that had undermined so much of the United Kingdom, a combination of neglect, ignorance, and ceaseless privatisation. The severity of the escalation when it came to the war meant that the United Kingdom never had the time to enter a state of vigilance, and if it did, it was far too late for all the plans to ever be implemented. This meant that several of the most key aspects of the readiness plan were never even started. Nothing had begun to be implemented. If Peter Newfield or any of his lackeys had ever really cared about the safety of their citizens, or even their own safety, they could have started rolling out the plans just in case something were to happen. But obviously, Peter Newfield had no such intentions. Peter Newfield was very angry that he had gotten the one thing in life he had wanted, and it was now going to be everyone else's problem. There was never any switch to a wartime economy, there was never any relocations prior to the attack, there was just a blind assumption that everything was going along fine and that nothing was going to change. Alongside this, the last official exercises for nuclear readiness had been organised prior to the blackout weeks, which was over 10 years ago by the time July 2043 arrived. An exercise, of course, can never compare to the reality of a situation, but it meant that there was an almost entirely new generation of councillors who had little to no clue that there even were preparations for a nuclear attack, let alone that they might need to know them within the next year or week or day. The assigned roles of authorities and the councillors behind them were either forgotten or disregarded. When the time came, these people would be playing an improv game or discovering all of the official advice after the fact. I hear you asking, why had there been no exercises? Doesn't that seem like something that would be carried out whether Peter Newfield wanted it or not? Well, as part of the continuing purchasing of state assets and handing out of ludicrously large contracts to private interests, the British government had officially handed out a covert and enormous contract to a private construction firm, Hunswell Capital, who was to be responsible for the creation of new regional headquarters, as well as the central headquarters from which the central government would be relocated. Exercises were scheduled to be held as soon as the new headquarters were constructed and deemed prepared, except they were never officially finished. Whilst the construction was overseen and completed by an engineer named Ilse Ludek, and please do remember that name because it's about to become very important, the company had been able to lie about the readiness of the project and practically force the government to continue paying out for a bunch of infrastructure that had already been completed. The government, either deliberately or blindly, went along with the Hunswell plan because the lobbyist responsible for the whole affair was one of the Newfield cabal. What makes it so astonishing is that, in hindsight, it is a hilariously small amount of money. I sincerely hope the men responsible met an end befitting this kind of idiocy. And this really is only the tip of a mountain of logistical and governmental issues that meant that the British state was blind towards its own unpreparedness. What had made so many within the government so confident in their own position was perhaps the one asset that had been afforded both time and attention. The decades leading up to the 2040s had seen a number of nation-states, not only the United Kingdom, undergo multi-billion-pound renovations to produce interconnected missile defence systems that were capable of shooting down incoming warheads. Many of the wars of the 2020s had demonstrated the necessity of a robust deterrent, and these were seen as the single most effective method to protect the nation from nuclear war and, hopefully, make the world a safer place. Except, it's probably true that these systems had instead been responsible for the nuclear war. As the decades crept by, there was a disturbing tendency to assume that these systems rendered their controllers immune to any retaliation from their adversaries, and so all of these nations who had access to these defence networks began to act with impunity on the global stage. Rather than making the world safer, they had encouraged more war, greater conflict, and pushed everyone closer to the edge. The United Kingdom was not unique in this regard, and its own system had become a much lauded part of its military. I have actually seen one of the installations at the edge of the Isles, and even under the layers of rust and overgrowth, they certainly look impressive. I'm sure they were designed to be impressive looking. But it had become common knowledge that the rhetoric surrounding them had quickly outpaced their actual capabilities, and though there had been some field tests to put a little strain on the system, the plan for their use had always vastly overestimated what they would be capable of handling. So even when it came to the one thing that the government was sure it could rely on, they couldn't actually rely on it. By the time we reached the 7th of July, 2043, much of the political class had been focused on Peter Newfield and a surprise that he had been cooking up during his absentee months. Whether he wielded any actual power, or whether he had been pressured to take action by the forces that moved around him, Newfield had announced that a cabinet reshuffle would be coming along shortly. This was something of a shock, and it had caused no amount of curiosity amongst the people in and around the Prime Minister. A cabinet reshuffle could have meant any number of things. It could have meant that Peter himself was attempting to reassert authority over his advisors. Or it could have meant that Peter himself had been entirely outmaneuvered by his advisors, and was now being directly told who they wanted in what positions. Why is this important to the events of the 8th of July? Because it meant that almost the entirety of the central government, the men, women, and others who surrounded Peter Newfield, were all brought together to see if they were about to survive the chop, and whether the man himself would survive. As will become important for the broad arcs of history, not the entirety of the political spectrum was in Westminster at that time. The Wednesday group, especially, had no interest in the internal machinations of Newfield's coalition, and most of its MPs were dispersed around the country, dealing with local matters. Whatever ghost of an opposition existed in the parties of the time would have also been in similar situations. And then, the wheels of the apocalypse begin to turn. I've been purposefully evasive about the causes of the nuclear exchange up until this point, to really dance around the fact that we don't know exactly what happened. The decisions that would come to be made were conducted in rooms so very far away from the Isles, in the utmost secrecy, and although we have spent the past 200 years attempting to engineer the events, we are still left with some guesswork. The best approach, I think, is to map out events from the perspective of the United Kingdom. Not only because this includes more information that the society can get its hands on, but also because it shows just how quickly events turned around, and how little control anyone had over anything. Just before midnight, on July the 7th, the United Kingdom was alerted by its allies of a potential strike they would be undertaking to neutralise certain assets. This was only a conventional strike, meaning that no nuclear weapons were planned to be used. As was befitting the country's reduced role in the diplomatic web that it sat, it was only alerted minutes before the strikes took place. What makes this so critical is that it is likely that Peter Newfield was awoken and told of this, but that he also probably didn't think much of it. It wasn't the first time his allies had conducted a strike, and it wouldn't be the last. And then, silence. Nothing. The world continues to tick for a few hours. Those intervening hours are quite interesting because most of the information at this point was likely stored online, digitally, and we don't have access to that. They've been completely lost. It's thought that journalists probably would have picked up on chatter between the two sides and begin to piece together that something was happening, but this is just purely speculation. The escalations began to arrive in earnest at 5 a.m. on July 8th. Still early enough that much of the country would not have been aware of their happening, but at a time when the political class would have almost certainly been made aware of their existence. Direct clashes, detonations in key facilities, the exact details are completely lost to time, but it would have been a marked increase in the conflict. At this point, we really do not know whether Newfield or any of his gang were ever even conscious. The most popular tale, which is almost certainly not true, but is darkly humorous, was that Peter Newfield was asleep, and when an aide tried to rouse him, he told them to return again within 3 hours. Again, very funny, given what would happen within 2 hours. The first signs of an attack would have arrived at around 7:25, as they were detected by early warning radars. The missile defense network would have been engaged, and they would have begun to track the threats. This was only 6 minutes before the first bombs would hit. Anyone who was in control, anyone who was in charge, whether this was their allies abroad or whether it was Peter Newfield himself in the heart of Westminster, would have only had minutes to take action. And it is likely that the only action they could have taken was ordering an attack in response. If the command was given to utilise the emergency messaging system, it was either unsuccessful or never made it out of the building. After this point, no one was in control. The first wave of missiles hit at 7:31 in the morning, and its targets included both military bases and London. This is when Rita Durrani took her famous picture, and she would have been considered lucky to have not been blinded. In theory, these missiles should have been stopped by the missile defense network, but instead, the entire system seemed to be non-functional. The Isles were now completely open to attack, and communication structures had now effectively been killed. So, as silent as the first strike had been, the Isles were even less prepared for the second wave. It is this second wave of missiles that is forever immortalised in our collective consciousness. for this was when the majority of the great cities were hit. It began at 7:53 a.m. and ended at 8:05 a.m. At least 20 detonations were detected at this point, hitting London, Glasgow, Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, Edinburgh, Leeds, Sheffield, Newcastle, and Cardiff. Whatever was left of the military installations in the first strike were then hit again by the second wave. For most people, the end of the world started and finished in just 12 minutes. Count it. You'll find it is no time at all. Those who had not been in any of the bombing targets would have become aware of the attacks at this point, but they would not have received any messages about it. Whether they were roused by the distant noise of shockwaves or by the people around them, they began to congregate outside to try and figure out what, if anything, was happening. The basic assumption was, initially, that the dead communication networks were the beginning of a second wave of the blackout weeks, and it was only after a few hours that they realised what had happened instead. But personally, many of the most chilling descriptions of events are by those who were far, far away from the attacks, and who only became aware of the events happening when they walked outside and saw a great cloud of ash begin to swallow the sky. There would always be a split between the two types of survivors, those who had experienced the 12 minutes as a visceral tearing apart of the world, and those who had seen it as a quiet dread that wound out across days and then weeks. The question of whether Newfield was ever aware of the disaster will forever be a mystery, and it will always be his enduring legacy. Nobody ever heard from him again. A better man in his position, even only a marginally better man, would have been able to do so much more. The nuclear readiness plans were, of course, completely unprepared for what had just occurred. Almost immediately, an enormous amount of the population had become casualties or fatalities, and all of the basic assumptions of modern society were about to break apart. There are no words that are big enough or meaningful enough to give weight to the events of the 12 minutes. They would come to reshape human history, and they would certainly reshape humanity's relationship with the world around them. But on an individual level, it would leave all of the survivors changed. They were all of them survivors, the last pre-war generation. And next episode, we will look at how they survived. Thanks for listening. If you like the show, do go support us on Patreon. It's the best and most direct way to ensure that the show can keep going, and you get access to all the episodes without any of the annoying ads. All the tiers get access to the same content, so you can pay as much or as little as you want. Go to patreon.com/LostSunSociety, all one word, or check out the link in the description. I'll see you next episode.